Sarah Miller should have been clutching her last few coins, saving them for the baby she was carrying, a baby who would soon be born into a world without a father. Instead, the pregnant widow walked into the grim spectacle of a county auction, the dust swirling around her worn-out boots, and did something nobody in Redemption's Gulch could possibly understand. She bought a man, not just any man, a cowboy beaten so far down by life, he was practically part of the dirt he stood on. A man broken by the town's cruelest tyrant, sold off like a piece of livestock alongside his silent, haunted son. Her desperate purchase wasn't an act of charity. It was the first shot fired in a war for survival, justice, and a secret so dark it had already cost one good man his life. A story that would end with the entire town weeping in the dust, wondering how they could have been so blind. The sun over Redemption's Gulch wasn't a sun, it was a hammer. A merciless, fiery hammer beating down on the cracked earth, on the sweat-stained hats, on the very soul of the town. This was a miserable place on a good day, a collection of rickety buildings leaning on each other for support, surrounded by an endless ocean of dust and skeletal trees. But today was not a good day. Today was auction day, a grim circus where the broken pieces of men's lives were sold off to the highest bidder, and under the flimsy shade of the auctioneer's platform, Jedediah Kane stood with his head bowed. The shame was a physical thing, a weight heavier than any anvil, pressing down on his shoulders. His shirt, once a sturdy blue, was now a tattered rag clinging to a frame, made gaunt by hunger and hard times. A fresh, ugly purple bruise swelled under his right eye, a gift from the man who had taken everything from him. He was a man whittled down to nothing but bone, regret, and a simmering, helpless rage that had nowhere to go. Clutching his pant leg, as if it were the last solid thing in the world, was his son, Cody. Just 6 years old, and Cody had already seen more of the world's cruelty than most men twice his age. His eyes, big and dark, held a haunted stillness. He hadn't spoken a single word in 3 months, not since the day Stephen Wilson's men had come to their farm. They weren't officially selling a man, of course. The poster nailed to the sheriff's office used a prettier phrase, indentured labor. But everyone knew what it was. It was slavery, plain and simple. Jedediah had lost it all. His small plot of land, his 24 cattle, even the simple wooden cross that marked his wife's grave. All of it swallowed by a debt he could never hope to repay. A debt owed to the town's undisputed ruler, Stephen Wilson. Wilson was a man whose wealth was matched only by his sadism. He hadn't just collected a debt. He had orchestrated Jedediah's ruin with the precision of a master puppeteer. He dammed the creek upstream, choking Jedediah's pasture to dust until his cattle died of thirst. Then he'd called in the loan with a smug, predatory smile. The beating had just been a little extra flourish, a parting gift. Now came the final humiliation. Him and his boy, sold off to the highest bidder for 5 years of hard labor. 5 years. A lifetime. The auctioneer, a portly man named Bartholomew with sweat stains under his arms, cleared his throat. "All right, folks, let's have a little quiet now. Up next, we have a prime lot. Strong back, this one," he lied, prodding Jedediah's bony shoulder. "Jedediah Kane, and he comes with the boy. Silent as a mouse, that one, and won't eat much. 5 years service. Who'll start the bidding at $20? A cruel chuckle rippled through the crowd. $20 was a fortune for a man who looked half dead. Most of the onlookers were just here for the show, a grim bit of entertainment to break the monotony of their own hard lives. And of course, Stephen Wilson was there. He leaned against a post of the general store, a gold watch chain gleaming on his tailored vest. He watched with an air of supreme satisfaction, the architect of this misery enjoying his handiwork. 15, then, Bartholomew barked, his face reddening. "Come on, man, he can still swing an axe." "I'll give you 5, a gruff voice called out. It was Hank, the local farrier, a man known for working his animals to death. Jedediah's stomach clenched into a tight, cold knot. He could already imagine Cody, small and silent, being subjected to that man's casual, everyday brutality. The thought was worse than any beating. $5, do I hear 6? Silence. The sun beat down. A fly buzzed lazily around Jedediah's head. He squeezed Cody's shoulder, a silent promise he wasn't sure he could keep. "I'll protect you. I'll find a way. Going once for $5, and it was in that moment of crushing, absolute finality that a new voice cut through the heavy, suffocating air. It was soft, but it was as clear as a bell. $25. Every single head in the square swiveled as one. The crowd of leathery-faced men parted, their expressions a mixture of confusion and pure disbelief. And there, standing at the back of the crowd, her hand resting on a belly swollen with the late stages of pregnancy, was Sarah Miller. Sarah was a widow, a relative newcomer to Redemption's Gulch. She'd arrived a year ago with her husband, John, a good man with big dreams of starting a small ranch. But a fever had taken John just 6 months later, leaving Sarah all alone to manage their small, isolated homestead on the edge of town. She was a quiet woman who kept to herself, a figure of some pity and a lot of speculation among the town's women. No one knew much about her, except that she was fiercely independent and now unmistakably pregnant. To see her here, at this sordid affair, was shocking enough. To see her bid, it was completely incomprehensible. Bartholomew's jaw went slack. I beg your pardon, Mrs. Miller. I said $25, Sarah repeated, and her voice didn't waver. Her gaze was fixed, not on the auctioneer, but directly on Jedediah. She met his astonished, questioning eyes, and for a fleeting, dizzying second, he saw something there. It wasn't pity. It was something harder, something that looked like resolve. Stephen Wilson pushed himself off the post, his look of amusement curdling into a dark scowl. This was not part of his script. He enjoyed the complete public subjugation of his victims. A quiet, pregnant widow interfering was an unwelcome distraction. The woman must be addled by the sun, Wilson drawled, loud enough for the whole town to hear. She has no need for a broken-down farmhand and his mute brat. Sarah ignored him. Her focus was entirely on the platform. Jedediah stared at her, at the swell of her stomach under her simple calico dress, at the determined set of her jaw. Why? Why would a woman in her position, a woman with her own monumental struggles, want to take on the burden of two more mouths to feed? One of them belonging to a man who was clearly nothing but trouble? It made no sense. It was a puzzle with no logical solution. Hank the farrier spat a wad of tobacco juice onto the ground. She ain't got $25. She's bluffing. As if in answer, Sarah reached into the small reticule that hung from her wrist. She pulled out a worn leather pouch, opened it, and tipped a small pile of coins into her palm. Silver and gold glinted in the harsh sunlight. A collective gasp went through the crowd. It was more real money than most of them had seen in months. Bartholomew, his professional greed overriding his surprise, grinned from ear to ear. Well now, we have a bid of $25 from Mrs. Miller. A respectable bid. Do I hear 30? He looked directly at Wilson, expecting him, daring him to assert his dominance. Wilson held Sarah's gaze, his eyes like chips of flint. He saw the defiance there, and it infuriated him. But he also saw the entire town watching. To bid against a pregnant widow for a man he had already publicly broken, it would look petty. It was a game of appearances, and for now he had to play it. With a sneer, he gave a slight shake of his head and turned his attention back to his gleaming pocket watch, feigning complete disinterest. But Jedediah saw the flicker of cold fury in his eyes. This wasn't over. $25 going once, Bartholomew shouted, his enthusiasm renewed. Going twice! Jedediah's heart hammered against his ribs. He looked from Wilson's sneering face to Sarah Miller's calm, determined one. He didn't understand what was happening, but a tiny spark of something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. Hope flickered in the desolate landscape of his soul. Sold! Bartholomew's gavel cracked down on the podium. For $25 to Mrs. Sarah Miller. The crowd began to disperse, muttering amongst themselves, the day's entertainment having reached its baffling, unexpected conclusion. Sarah walked forward, her steps measured and sure. She mounted the 2 steps of the platform and handed the coins to the auctioneer without a single word. Then she turned to Jedediah. Up close, he could see the weariness around her eyes, the fine lines of worry etched at the corners of her mouth. This was not the act of a wealthy benefactor. This was a sacrifice. He could tell with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that she had just spent every last cent she had in the world. "Mr. Kane," she said, her voice still soft. She then knelt with some difficulty to be level with Cody, who flinched and tried to hide behind his father's legs. Sarah didn't try to touch him. She just offered a small, gentle smile. "Hello, Cody." Jedediah finally found his voice. It was a rough, cracked whisper. "Why?" Sarah stood up, her clear, startlingly blue eyes meeting his once more. And in their depths, he saw a world of unspoken sorrow. "Because no child should have to watch his father be sold," she said simply. "And because my husband was a good man who believed in second chances." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the dusty square, over the lingering, judging eyes of the townspeople. "Now," she said, her voice a little stronger, "gather your son. We have a long walk home." As Jedediah Kane, the beaten cowboy, and his silent son Cody followed the pregnant widow out of Redemption's Gulch, the town was left in a state of stunned silence. They had witnessed a transaction, but they had no idea of the true cost, or the storm that had just been unleashed. For Stephen Wilson, it was a loose thread, and Stephen Wilson always tied up his loose threads. The walk to Sarah Miller's homestead was a silent procession of ghosts. Sarah led the way, her gait slow and deliberate, a testament to the weight she carried, both the baby in her womb and, it seemed, the weight of the entire world. Jedediah followed a few paces behind, a coiled spring of weariness, suspicion, and a confusion so profound it made his head ache. His hand never left Cody's shoulder. It was a constant, grounding touch, a silent message. "I'm still here. We're still together." The boy, for his part, kept his eyes fixed on the dust, his father's broken boots kicked up, a small, tragic shadow trailing in their wake. The whispers and stares of the townspeople felt like daggers in Jedediah's back. He heard snippets of conversation carried on the wind. "Lost her mind. What's a woman like that want with him? Wilson's going to be furious." Each word was another layer of grime on his already sullied reputation. He was a spectacle, a curiosity, a burden. He glanced at the woman leading them. Her back was straight, her head held high, as if she were completely deaf to the venom being spat in her direction. She didn't look back. Not once. They left the main dusty track of town and turned onto a smaller, less traveled path that wound its way through sparse grasslands and thirsty-looking mesquite trees. The homestead, when it finally came into view, was exactly as Jedediah had imagined. Small, solitary, and clinging to life by a thread. It was a simple cabin of hewn logs, chinked with mud and straw, with a stone chimney, breathing a thin plume of smoke into the vast, indifferent sky. A tidy but struggling vegetable garden lay to one side, its rows meticulously weeded. A small, sturdy corral held a single, placid-looking mare. It was a place of profound quiet. The clamor of the town faded away, replaced by the sigh of the wind and the distant cry of a hawk. But the quiet wasn't entirely peaceful. It was the quiet of loneliness, of a life lived on the very edge of existence. Jedediah, a farmer by blood, saw everything in an instant. He saw the woodpile that was far too small for the coming winter. He saw the section of roof that was sagging and needed patching. He saw the fence that leaned at a precarious angle. This was not the home of a wealthy savior. This was the home of a woman who had just spent her last dollar on him. The question, why, burned hotter and more confusingly than ever. Sarah led them not to the main cabin, but to a small outbuilding nearby, likely a bunkhouse for a hired hand that had long since departed. It was small, but it was clean. A simple cot was pushed against one wall, a pile of clean hay in the corner, with a threadbare but neatly folded blanket on top, served as a second bed. A pitcher of water and a basin stood on a wooden crate. "This will be yours," Sarah said, her voice neutral, businesslike. She didn't invite them into her home, and Jedediah felt a strange mix of offense and relief. She was keeping her distance. That, at least, was a language he understood. "The well is over there. Supper will be in an hour. You can wash up." She turned and walked back to the main cabin, her form silhouetted against the setting sun. leaving them alone in the deepening twilight. For a long moment, Jedediah didn't move. He simply stood in the doorway, listening to the sound of his own ragged breathing. He was a free man who wasn't free at all. He had been bought and paid for, traded from one master to another. He just didn't know the terms of this new, unspoken contract. Cody finally let go of his pant leg and walked slowly into the small room. He ran a tiny, dirt-streaked hand over the rough-spun blanket on the haybed, his touch light and curious. Jedediah watched him, his heart a painful knot in his chest. He had failed his son so completely. He had promised to protect him, and instead, he had led them here, to another stranger's charity, another unknown future. He poured some water into the basin and gently began to clean the grime and dried blood from his own face, wincing as the cool water touched the tender bruise around his eye. He then did the same for Cody, washing his face and hands with a tenderness that belied his own rough appearance. The boy submitted without a sound, his dark eyes watching his father's every move, his expression unreadable. An hour later, as promised, Sarah returned. She carried a wooden tray with 3 plates of food, a simple stew of potatoes and salted pork, and thick slices of dark bread. It wasn't a feast, but to Jedediah, who had eaten nothing but scraps for days, it smelled like heaven. She set the tray down on the floor just inside the bunkhouse door. "Eat," she said, and left as quietly as she came. Jedediah served his son first, watching as Cody, after a moment's hesitation, began to eat with a slow, deliberate hunger. Only then did Jedediah allow himself to take a plate. The stew was hot, salty, and life-giving. It was the first act of simple, uncomplicated kindness he had received in months, and it was so foreign that it felt like a trick. He ate with his back to the wall, his eyes on the door, every nerve ending on high alert, waiting for the other shoe to drop. What would she expect in return for this food? For this roof? What work, what degradation would be demanded of him come morning? Meanwhile, back in town, the saloon was buzzing with the day's events. The story of the pregnant widow had grown with each telling. "Bought him right out from under Wilson's nose," one man chortled into his beer. "She's a fool," declared another, a grim-faced rancher. "Kane is trouble, always has been, and now he's living right on her land. A lone woman like that." He let the sentence hang in the air, thick with insinuation. At his usual corner table, Stephen Wilson sat nursing a whiskey, his face a thundercloud. His men, a pair of thuggish brothers named Eli and Jeb, stood nervously by. "Want us to pay her a visit, Mr. Wilson?" Eli asked, eager to please. "Remind her who runs this valley?" Wilson took a slow, deliberate sip of his whiskey, the amber liquid glowing in the lamplight. "No," he said, his voice a low growl. "Not yet. This isn't about the $25. It's about the message. She defied me publicly. People are talking. An act like that requires a more delicate response." He stared into his glass, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "Let her have her charity case. Let her think she's won. A pregnant woman, a broken-down cowboy, and a mute kid. They'll destroy each other long before I have to lift a finger. And when they do," he added softly, "I'll be there to pick up the pieces." Back at the homestead, the last light had bled from the sky, leaving a blanket of stars so bright they seemed to crackle in the silence. Cody was asleep in the hay, his small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm, one hand clutching the edge of the blanket. He looked peaceful, for the first time in a very long time. Jedediah, however, couldn't sleep. He lay on the cot, every muscle aching, his mind a maelstrom of confusion and fear. He replayed the auction in his head over and over, the jeering crowd, Wilson's smug face, and then Sarah Miller's clear, steady voice. Because no child should have to watch his father be sold. The words echoed in his mind. It was a noble sentiment, but he'd learned long ago that nobility was a luxury few could afford, and fewer still actually possessed. People acted out of self-interest. Kindness was just a currency used to purchase something later. What did she want? Was she simply lonely? Did she need a man to work her land, a man she could own and control, indebted to her in a way no hired hand ever could be? He thought of her swollen belly. She was bringing a new life into this world, a world that had taken her husband and left her completely alone. Maybe it was a simple, desperate act of a woman trying to build some semblance of a family, a fortress against the encroaching loneliness. He didn't know, and the not knowing was its own special kind of torture. He stared out the open doorway at the small cabin across the yard, where a single lamp still burned in the window. He was in her debt, owned by her kindness. And for a man like Jedediah Kane, who had lost everything he ever valued, that was the most terrifying place in the world to be. He suddenly noticed something he hadn't before. On the inside of the bunkhouse door, carved into the wood at about eye level, was a strange symbol. It looked like a bird, or maybe an angel, inside a circle. It was old, the wood around it darkened with age. It seemed deliberate, a marker. What did it mean? Was it a warning? A message from the man who had slept in this bed before him? Her husband, John? The questions piled up, each one heavier than the last, pressing down on him in the suffocating darkness. The first morning at the homestead, Jedediah was awake before the sun, his body thrumming with the anxious energy of a man expecting a blow. He dressed in the gray pre-dawn light and stepped out of the bunkhouse, his eyes scanning the yard for Sarah, anticipating her orders. But the main cabin was still dark and silent. Instead of a list of commands, he found a whetstone, a file, and a heavy felling axe laid neatly on the chopping block. Beside them was a length of rope and a shovel. There was no note, no verbal command. It was a silent instruction, a test. Show me what you are worth. It was a language he understood far better than kindness. He picked up the axe, feeling its familiar weight. The handle was smooth, worn by another man's hands. Her husband's, he presumed. A pang of something uncomfortable like trespassing went through him. He ignored it and got to work. The days that followed fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the land. Jedediah worked with a feverish, almost manic intensity, channeling all his fear and confusion into relentless labor. He chopped and stacked a mountain of firewood, far more than was needed for the coming winter. He repaired the leaning fence post by post, his movements economical and precise. He dug a new irrigation ditch from the well to the wilting vegetable garden, his muscles screaming in protest. But he pushed on, driven by a desperate, unspoken need to repay the $25, to erase the debt that bound him to this place and this woman. Sarah, in turn, moved through her own quiet routines. She tended her garden, salted and preserved what vegetables she could, and spent long hours mending clothes preparing for the baby's arrival. They coexisted in a strange, silent orbit, two planets in the same small solar system, held in place by a shared gravity, but never touching. Their conversations were brief and practical, clipped sentences exchanged across the yard. The well pump is sticking. I'll look at it. There's bread on the table. Thank you, ma'am. He never called her Sarah. She never called him Jedediah. He was the hand. She was the provider. It was a simple, stark arrangement that kept the terrifying complexities of their situation at bay. The only bridge between their two desolate worlds was Cody. For the first week, the boy was his father's echo, a silent shadow that never strayed more than a few feet from him. He would sit on a log watching Jedediah work, his small face a mask of solemnity. But slowly, curiosity began to win out over fear. He started to watch Sarah. He'd hide behind the corner of the bunkhouse and observe her as she hung laundry, her swollen form moving with a graceful weariness. He watched her talk to her mare in low, soothing tones. One afternoon, Sarah was sitting on her porch, carving a piece of scrap wood with a small knife. She was humming a soft, tuneless melody, a sound that seemed to blend with the whisper of the wind. Cody watched from his hiding spot, mesmerized by the slow, deliberate transformation of the wood in her hands. When Sarah finally got up to go inside, she left the finished object on the porch railing. It was a small, intricately carved bluebird, its wings slightly outstretched as if about to take flight. She didn't look in Cody's direction or acknowledge his presence in any way. She just went inside. For a long time after she disappeared into the cabin, Cody remained hidden. Then, moving with the speed and silence of a field mouse, he darted onto the porch, snatched the wooden bird, and retreated back to the safety of the bunkhouse. Jedediah, who had seen the whole exchange from the woodpile, felt his throat tighten. Later that evening, he saw Cody asleep in the hay, The small bird clutched tightly in his hand. It was the first possession the boy had claimed since they'd lost everything. The catalyst for change arrived a week later, born on a dark, bruised-looking cloud that rolled in from the west. The sky turned from a placid blue to a churning slate gray in a matter of minutes. The wind, which usually sighed, began to howl, tearing at the roof of the cabin and whipping the dust into furious devils. "The mare!" Sarah cried, her voice sharp with alarm as she struggled to close and bar the shutters on the main cabin. "She'll bolt!" Jedediah didn't hesitate. He sprinted to the corral as the first fat drops of rain began to fall. The horse was wild-eyed with panic, rearing and pulling against her tether. He spoke to her in a low, steady voice, the same way he used to calm his own animals, and managed to grab her halter, leading the skittish animal into the relative safety of the small lean-to stable. Just as he secured the door, the heavens opened. Rain came down not in sheets but in a solid, deafening wall of water. A jagged fork of lightning split the sky, followed an instant later by a crack of thunder, so loud it shook the very ground. From the stable, Jedediah saw Sarah, her dress soaked and clinging to her, fighting to stretch a canvas tarp over her precious vegetable garden. The wind caught it like a sail, nearly pulling her off her feet. "Get inside!" he roared over the storm, running to her side. "The crops! We'll lose them!" she yelled back, her face a mask of desperate determination. Together they wrestled the bucking canvas, the wind and rain trying to tear it from their grasp. For those few frantic minutes, they were not owner and servant, not benefactor and burden. They were just two people fighting against a common enemy, a team. They finally managed to secure the tarp with heavy rocks. Soaked to the bone and gasping for breath, they stumbled back toward the cover of the porch. Another deafening crash of thunder echoed, and this one was followed by a different sound, a child's terrified cry. It was the first sound Cody had made in over 3 months. They both froze, turning towards the bunkhouse. Jedediah was there in 3 strides, bursting through the door to find Cody huddled in the corner, shaking, his face buried in the hay. A steady stream of water was pouring from a new leak in the roof, right over his cot. Jedediah scooped his son into his arms, holding him tight, murmuring words of comfort. Sarah appeared in the doorway, her face pale with concern. "Bring him to the cabin," she said, her voice soft but firm. "He can't stay here." Inside the main cabin, the air was warm and dry, smelling of pine smoke and baking bread. It was the first time Jedediah had been inside. Sarah gave him a dry blanket for Cody, who was still trembling. She bustled about, lighting another lamp, her earlier composure replaced by a gentle, maternal fussing. She made them hot, sweet tea, and for the first time, the 3 of them sat together at her small kitchen table. The storm raged outside, but inside the small cabin, a fragile peace had settled. "That was my John's favorite sound," Sarah said quietly, staring into her teacup. "He always said it was the land drinking its fill." Jedediah looked at her, at the soft light of the lamp on her face. He thought of his own wife, Mary, and how she used to love the smell of rain on dry earth. "My Mary, she loved that smell," he heard himself say. The words were rusty, unused. Sarah looked up, her blue eyes meeting his. There was no pity in them, only a shared understanding of loss. "You had a good farm before." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. "It was," Jedediah said, a world of pain in those 2 simple words. "It was a good piece of land, good water. We were building something." He looked down at Cody, who had finally fallen asleep in his lap, the wooden bird still clutched in his hand. For him, it was the most he had spoken in months. Saying it out loud, admitting what he had lost, was like lancing a wound. It hurt, but it let some of the poison out. He looked at Sarah again, truly looked at her. He saw the strength in her hands, the resilience in the lines around her eyes, the profound loneliness she carried with the same quiet dignity as her pregnancy. This woman hadn't bought a laborer. She had rescued a father. She hadn't been acting out of simple charity or pity. It was something deeper, something rooted in her own pain and her own fierce, desperate hope. And as the storm began to subside, replaced by the gentle patter of rain, Jedediah felt a subtle shift inside him. The suspicion hadn't vanished completely, The world had taught him too well for that, but it was now joined by something new and unfamiliar, a burgeoning respect, and deeper still, a nascent, fiercely protective instinct. This small cabin, this woman, this sleeping child in his arms, this was his world now. And as he looked out the window into the clean-washed darkness, he knew with a certainty that both terrified and thrilled him that he would protect it no matter the cost. The storm washed away more than just the dust. In its wake, a new fragile landscape of trust began to emerge at the homestead. The strict, silent boundaries between Jedediah and Sarah softened and blurred. The mornings were still quiet, but now it was a comfortable quiet, punctuated by shared glances and the occasional brief smile. Jedediah no longer waited for silent instructions laid out like a test. He started to see the farm not as a series of tasks to be completed, but as a living entity that needed care. He found a small leather-bound journal in the bunkhouse, tucked under a loose floorboard right beneath that strange carved symbol on the door. It was Sarah's late husband's. It was filled with plans and drawings. A new design for a chicken coop that was supposedly fox-proof, a better layout for the stable, a diagram for a field that should be cleared for corn. It was the work of a man who saw potential, not just hardship. He didn't ask for permission. He simply started the work, mending John's dreams as much as the property itself. One evening, he brought the journal into the cabin. He showed a specific drawing to Sarah. "Your husband was a smart man," he said, his voice low. "This design for the coop, it's good. The counter-weighted door, it'll keep the foxes out." Sarah traced the faded ink drawing with her finger, a sad, fond smile on her lips. "He always had a plan," she whispered. "He saw what this place could be." She looked up at Jedediah, her eyes shining in the lamplight. "He would have liked you." The words hung in the air between them, a profound and unexpected gift. Jedediah simply nodded, unable to form a reply, and retreated to the safety of his work, his heart hammering in his chest. The biggest change, however, was in Cody. The little wooden bird was his constant companion, a talisman he clutched in his hand or kept safely tucked in his pocket. He started to follow Sarah around the garden, his silence no longer one of fear, but of quiet observation. He would hand her a weeding tool she'd dropped, or point to a ripe tomato she had missed. The real breakthrough came on a bright, clear morning about a week later. Sarah was feeding the mare, her back to the yard. She didn't see the garter snake slithering out from the woodpile, a harmless creature, but startling nonetheless. Cody, sitting on the bunkhouse steps, saw it. His eyes went wide. He shot to his feet, his small body tense as a wire. He opened his mouth and a sound, raw and desperate, tore from his throat. "Snake!" The word was a croak, cracked and rough from disuse, but it was as clear as a gunshot in the morning quiet. Sarah flinched back from the horse, startled more by the boy's voice than the snake, which had already vanished into the grass. She turned to look at Cody, her heart leaping into her throat. Jedediah, who had been splitting logs, dropped his axe. He and Sarah stared at the boy, who now looked absolutely terrified by his own outburst, as if he'd broken a sacred vow. Sarah moved slowly. She knelt, just as she had at the auction, and gave him a slow, gentle smile. "Thank you, Cody," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You protected me." From that day on, Cody's silence receded like a slow tide. It started with single words, water, bread, more, and gradually blossomed into short, hesitant sentences. The sound of his child's voice, tentative and sweet, filled the quiet spaces of the homestead, stitching the three of them together into something that looked, startlingly, like a family. But in a land like Redemption's Gulch, peace is a fleeting thing, a mirage in the desert. Their quiet, self-contained world had not gone unnoticed. In town, the story of the pregnant widow and her indentured cowboy had become a fixture of local gossip. And all of it, every whispered rumor, every cruel joke, eventually made its way back to Stephen Wilson. Wilson was not a patient man. He had expected Cain to fail, to run, or for the woman to cast him out in despair. This quiet domesticity, this story of redemption unfolding on his doorstep, was an insult. It was a direct challenge to the narrative of fear and dominance he had so carefully crafted for the entire valley. It was time for a reminder. The reminder came a week later. Jedediah was repairing the sagging section of the main cabin's roof while Sarah and Cody pulled weeds in the garden below. A flicker of movement on the ridge overlooking their property caught his eye. He froze, his hand tightening on his hammer. 3 riders sat on horseback, motionless, their forms stark silhouettes against the bright blue sky. Even from this distance, he recognized the expensive cut of the center rider's coat and the brutish slump of the 2 men who flanked him. Wilson, with Eli and Jeb. They weren't doing anything. They weren't trespassing. They weren't shouting. They weren't even looking directly at him. They were just there, watching. It was a calculated act of psychological warfare, a pure display of power. I see you. You are on my land, breathing my air. You exist because I allow it, and I can stop allowing it at any time. Sarah saw them too. She straightened up, her hand instinctively going to her stomach. She pulled Cody behind her, shielding him with her body. The boy, picking up on the sudden, thick tension, fell silent once more. For 10 agonizing minutes, the silent standoff continued. The world seemed to hold its breath. Finally, Wilson turned his horse and the 3 men disappeared over the ridge as silently as they had appeared. But their presence lingered, a poison in the air. The fragile peace of the homestead had been shattered. "He's just trying to scare us," Sarah said that evening, though her voice trembled slightly. "He's succeeding," Jedediah replied grimly. The old familiar rage was beginning to bubble up inside him, cold and dangerous. He had tasted a moment of peace, a sliver of hope, and now Wilson was trying to steal that too. Wilson's next move was more insidious. A few days later, Sarah took their small cart into town for supplies: flour, salt, coffee. She went to Peterson's general store, as she always did. Mr. Peterson, a balding man with nervous, darting eyes, had always been kind to her, even extending credit when her husband John was sick. But today he wouldn't meet her gaze. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he mumbled, wringing his hands. I can't give you these on credit today." Sarah was taken aback. "I'm good for it, Arthur. You know that. The egg money will be in next week." "It's not that," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper as he glanced nervously toward the street. "It's my own accounts. I've been called on. I can't extend any more credit to anyone." Sarah knew instantly what it meant. She could practically see the long, cruel shadow of Stephen Wilson falling over the entire store. She paid for what little she could with the few coins she had, and left, her face pale, her heart heavy with a cold, creeping dread. When she told Jedediah what had happened, he exploded. All the progress, all the quiet healing of the past weeks seemed to vanish, consumed by a white-hot fury. He kicked over the chopping block, the wood scattering like bowling pins. "That's it," he snarled, his eyes blazing with a dangerous light. "I'm not going to sit here and wait for him to starve us out. I'll ride into town. I'll face him, man to man." It was the old Jedediah, the impulsive, angry man who had lost everything because he fought with his fists instead of his head. He started for the stable, for the mare. "No!" Sarah's voice was sharp, commanding. She stood directly in his path, her chin raised, her eyes fierce. She was not the soft, gentle woman of the past weeks. In that moment, she was a lioness defending her den. "Get out of my way, Sarah," he growled. "No," she repeated, standing her ground despite his menacing posture. "Is that your answer to everything, Jedediah? Violence? Look where it got you last time. Is that what you want for Cody? To see his father beaten to a pulp or thrown in jail? Or worse?" Her words were like a slap in the face. He stopped, his chest heaving. She was right. He looked over at the cabin door where Cody was peering out, his small face a mirror of his own past terror. "He is trying to break us, Jedediah," Sarah said, her voice softening slightly but losing none of its steel. "He's trying to turn you back into the man you were, and me into a helpless victim. He expects you to come charging in. He's waiting for it. We can't give him the fight he wants." "Then what do we do?" Jedediah asked, the rage deflating into bitter helplessness. "We just let him choke us off. We starve." "No," she said, stepping closer. And for the first time, she reached out and laid a hand on his arm. Her touch was surprisingly firm, grounding. We survive. We outsmart him. Your husband's journal, Jedediah. The plans for the chickens, for the corn, the traps he designed to catch rabbits and quail. We have water. We have land. We have this. She gestured to the world around them, the world they had started to build together. We don't need the town. We don't need their credit. We need each other. Jedediah looked down at her hand on his arm, then back to her face. He saw no fear in her eyes, only an iron resolve that matched his own. She wasn't just his protector or his benefactor. She was his partner, his general. The choice was clear. He could ride into town and give Wilson the satisfaction of destroying him once and for all. Or he could stay. He could fight this new way, her way. He could fight for the man he was becoming, not the man he had been. Slowly, deliberately, he unclenched his fists. "All right, Sarah," he said, the name finally feeling right on his tongue. "All right, we do it your way." But as he looked past her, toward the bunkhouse, he thought again of that strange symbol carved on the door and the journal he'd found hidden beneath the floor. There was more to this fight than just survival. John Miller had been planning something, and Jedediah was beginning to suspect that Sarah knew a whole lot more than she was letting on. Wilson's embargo, intended to isolate and starve them, had the exact opposite effect. It forged Jedediah and Sarah into a single unit with a shared, defiant purpose. The imaginary line between the main cabin and the bunkhouse dissolved. They now took all their meals together at the small kitchen table, poring over John's journal like it was a sacred text, a blueprint for survival. Under Sarah's strategic guidance, in Jedediah's relentless labor, the homestead transformed. It became a fortress of ingenuity, built from scraps and sheer determination. Jedediah, using John's clever, counterweighted designs from the journal, built a chicken coop from reclaimed lumber and scavenged wire. It was a masterpiece of function, secure against any predator that might creep in from the scrubland. He followed another set of diagrams to construct a series of cunning box traps and snares, which he set along the game trails behind the property. Soon, their simple stews of salted pork and potatoes were enriched with the welcome taste of rabbit and quail. Sarah, in turn, managed their dwindling resources with a general's precision. She taught Jedediah the art of foraging, pointing out edible roots and hardy greens he had overlooked his entire life. They were a team. He was the hands, she was the head. He would work until his muscles screamed, and she would be there with a plate of food and a quiet word of encouragement that was more restorative than an hour of rest. The intimacy of their shared struggle was a powerful, unspoken thing that grew between them in the quiet moments. He grew to know the rhythms of her day, the weary way she rubbed the small of her back in the evenings, the soft hum that meant she was content. She, in turn, saw past the broken cowboy from the auction. She saw the fierce intelligence in his eyes as he solved a construction problem, the profound gentleness in his large, calloused hands as he helped Cody whittle his own small animal from a piece of wood, a clumsy imitation of the bird she had carved for him. One afternoon, they were cleaning out a small wooden chest that held John's few remaining personal effects to make room for baby clothes. Sarah suddenly went quiet. Cody, who was helping by taking things out and putting them back, pulled out a tarnished silver locket. It was oval-shaped and completely unadorned. He held it up to her. "Pretty?" he said. Sarah's breath hitched. She took the locket from him, her fingers tracing its smooth surface. A look of deep, complicated sorrow passed over her face, so raw that Jedediah, who was watching from the doorway, felt like an intruder. "It was my mother's," she said, her voice a near whisper. She didn't open it. Instead, she clutched it tightly in her fist for a long moment before placing it carefully back in the chest. "We should keep it safe." The moment passed, but it left a question hanging in the air, a piece of the puzzle that didn't fit. A few nights later, while studying John's journal for a design on how to best dig a root cellar, Jedediah found something that wasn't a diagram. Tucked into the very back pages, written in a cramped, urgent script, was a list of names and dates. Most were unfamiliar, but one entry, dated just a week before John's death, stood out. "Met with A. Bishop in Dusty Flats, west of Redemption. He agrees. The risk is great, But the proof is undeniable. He will send word to the marshal in Prescott. Must protect S at all costs. She knows nothing of this. A cold knot formed in Jedediah's stomach. Sarah. She knows nothing of this. What didn't she know? Who was A. Bishop? He read the line again. The proof is undeniable. It sounded like a conspiracy, a dangerous secret that had died with its author. He looked over at Sarah, dozing in her chair by the fire, her pregnant form radiating a fragile peace. He thought of the locket, the sudden pain in her eyes. He thought of her quiet, self-contained nature, and her shocking, seemingly insane decision at the auction. He had assumed her story was simple, a widow, left alone, making a desperate move. But what if it wasn't? What if the fever that took John wasn't just a random act of fate? Wilson had the motive and a complete lack of morals. The thought was chilling. This woman who had saved him was entangled in something far more dangerous than a bad debt. She wasn't just a victim. She was a keeper of a secret she might not even know she had. He quietly closed the journal. This was a secret he would keep, a burden he would carry for her. His protective instinct, already strong, now hardened into a shield of diamond resolve. He wasn't just protecting a kind woman and his son. He was protecting a mystery, a legacy he didn't yet understand. And he was beginning to realize that the $25 she had paid for him was the smallest part of the debt he owed her. Autumn bled into the landscape, painting the sparse foliage in hues of rust and gold. The nights grew colder, and the wind carried the sharp promise of winter. Their root cellar was full. The woodpile was a fortress. The new chicken coop was a quiet success, providing them with precious eggs. They had done it. They had survived Wilson's siege. But as Sarah's time drew near, a new kind of tension settled over the homestead. Every twinge, every sigh from her sent a spike of anxiety through Jedediah. He was a farmer and a fighter, not a midwife. The vast, empty space around them suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like a trap. The first real contraction hit Sarah just after dusk. She was standing by the stove when she gasped, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the edge of the table. Jedediah was at her side in an instant, his heart seizing in his chest. "It's time," she said, her voice tight with a mixture of fear and awe. And as if summoned by their crisis, a new menace appeared on the horizon. Cody, who was looking out the window, pointed a trembling finger toward the ridge. "Men," he whispered. Jedediah's blood ran cold. He peered out into the deepening twilight. Two figures on horseback were riding slowly, deliberately towards the homestead, Eli and Jeb. But this time, they weren't just watching. This time, Jeb was carrying a lit torch, its flames dancing hungrily in the wind. Rage, pure, absolute, and incandescent, surged through Jedediah. To come now, on this night of all nights, it was a level of calculated cruelty that defied comprehension. Wilson wasn't just trying to break them anymore. He was trying to erase them. Sarah saw the murderous look in his eyes, the way his hands clenched into fists that were white at the knuckles. "No, Jedediah," she gasped, gripping his arm with surprising strength as another contraction seized her. "Don't leave me. Please." He was torn. His every instinct screamed at him to go out there, to meet them, to break them with his bare hands. But he looked at her face, pale and beaded with sweat in the lamplight, and he knew he could not leave her side. "Bar the door," he ordered, his voice low and hard, "and stay away from the window." He helped her to the bed, his mind racing faster than it ever had before. He couldn't fight them head on, not without leaving Sarah vulnerable. He had to use the land. He had to use John's designs. He had to fight smart. "Cody," he said, his voice miraculously calm, despite the storm raging in his chest. "I need you to be a brave soldier. I need you to stay with Sarah and hold her hand. Can you do that for me?" The boy, his eyes wide with fear but filled with a trust that nearly broke Jedediah's heart, nodded mutely. Outside, Eli and Jeb had reached the fence line. "Evening, Kane," Eli shouted, his voice thick with smug malice. "Mr. Wilson sends his regards. Says your lease is up." Jedediah ignored them. He grabbed a length of rope and slipped out the back door of the cabin, melting into the shadows like a ghost. He moved with a hunter's silence, circling around towards the new chicken coop. The target Jeb was clearly heading for with the torch. He reached the series of quail traps he had set just inside the scrub line. One of John's designs was a simple but brutally effective snare, a rope loop connected to a bent sapling, triggered by a nearly invisible tripwire. Jedediah checked the tension, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Jeb, clumsy and arrogant, dismounted and swaggered towards the coop, the torch held high. "Time to light the fire, little chickens," he cackled to himself. He took 3 more steps and his boot snagged on the tripwire. The sapling sprang free with a vicious thwip. The rope snapped tight around Jeb's ankle, and he was violently yanked upside down, dangling a foot off the ground. He let out a comical shriek of surprise and terror as his torch flew from his hand, extinguishing itself in the damp earth. Eli, hearing his brother scream, spun around, drawing his pistol. "Who's there? Show yourself, Cain!" From the other side of the yard, a rock clattered against the wall of the lean-to stable. Eli, completely distracted, fired a wild shot into the darkness. It was the opening Jedediah needed. He burst from the shadows, not with a roar, but with a charging, silent fury. He didn't aim for Eli's head or body. He tackled him low at the knees, using his full weight and momentum to drive the bigger man backward. Eli stumbled, his second shot going wild into the sky, and crashed headfirst into the heavy wooden rail of the corral. He went down in a heap and didn't move. Silence. Jedediah stood over the unconscious man, his chest heaving. He hadn't thrown a single punch. He had used his mind, his environment. He had won Sarah's way. A sharp, piercing cry from the cabin cut through his momentary victory. "Sarah!" He raced back inside to find her in the throes of a powerful contraction, Cody holding her hand, his small face a mask of terror and incredible courage. The rest of the night was a blur of pain and prayer, of boiled water and torn sheets. Jedediah, his hands still shaking with adrenaline, coached her through it, his voice a low, steady anchor in her sea of pain. He followed her instructions, his earlier fear replaced by a sharp, focused determination. In the darkest hour just before the dawn, the cabin was filled with a new sound. It was thin but powerful, the cry of a newborn baby. Jedediah, covered in sweat and tears of his own, carefully wrapped the tiny, squirming infant in a clean blanket and placed her in Sarah's waiting arms. "A girl," Sarah wept, her voice weak but filled with an overwhelming, luminous love. "We have a daughter." Jedediah looked at them, at this fierce, incredible woman and the new life she had brought into the world. He looked at Cody, who was peering at his new sister with wide, wondrous eyes. Outside, one man was tied up and another lay unconscious. The world had tried its very best to tear them apart. But here, in the heart of the storm, they had created a new life. As the first light of dawn crept through the window, Jedediah Cain knew that everything had changed. The fight was no longer just about survival. It was about building a future. The new dawn brought with it the cry of a newborn baby, whom Sarah named Hope, and the groans of 2 of Wilson's thugs, one tied securely to a fence post and the other nursing a lump on his head. The scene guaranteed a visit from the law, and Sheriff Miller, a man who generally preferred to look the other way, arrived first, his face a mask of weary resignation. But he wasn't alone. Riding just behind him were 2 other men. One was a tall, grim-faced U.S. Marshal named Frank Rock, whose eyes missed nothing. The other was an older man with a kind but serious face. "We were told to look for a Mr. Amos Bishop," Marshal Rock announced, his authoritative gaze sweeping over the scene. The tied-up man, the new baby, the exhaustion and defiance on Jedediah's face. The older man stepped forward. "I am Amos Bishop. I was to meet a man named John Miller here." Jedediah's mind reeled as the last pieces of the puzzle slammed into place. A. Bishop, the journal. "We've been investigating Stephen Wilson for months on charges ranging from land fraud to murder," the marshal continued, his voice hard as iron. "Your husband, Mrs. Miller, was our key witness. He had gathered the evidence we needed. It all made sense now. The secrecy, the fever that had taken John just after he met with Bishop. It wasn't a tragedy. It was an assassination." Sarah, holding Hope tightly in the doorway of the cabin, confirmed their fears, her voice trembling but clear. "John is dead. Wilson killed him." I knew he was doing something dangerous. I was so terrified Wilson would come for me next, and for whatever proof John had hidden away. She looked directly at Jedediah, her eyes filled with a truth so profound it took his breath away. That's why I went to the auction, she confessed, tears streaming down her face. I couldn't protect myself. Not alone. I needed a fighter. I needed a man who looked so broken that Wilson wouldn't see him as a threat. I needed someone to protect John's legacy, to guard this land until help arrived. It was a desperate, insane gamble. John mentioned one final piece of proof in his last letter to me, Amos Bishop said gently. Something he said you would know how to find, Sarah. Something from your mother. Jedediah's gaze fell to the small wooden chest by the door, and then to the tarnished silver locket that Cody was now holding in his hand. A flash of insight, sharp and certain, struck him. He gently took the locket from the boy. He turned it over and over in his calloused fingers, searching for what John must have seen. He found a tiny, almost invisible catch along the seam and pressed it. The locket sprang open. Inside there was no portrait. There was only a tiny, tightly folded piece of paper and a small, ornate brass key. The paper, when the marshal carefully unfolded it, was the original, unaltered deed to the land that formed the cornerstone of Wilson's entire empire. Land he had stolen through murder and forgery years ago. The key, Bishop explained, was for a safe deposit box in Prescott, a box containing sworn, notarized statements from a dozen other men Wilson had ruined. It was over. Wilson's entire kingdom was built on a foundation of lies, and they now held the proof. When a furious Stephen Wilson rode out to the homestead later that morning to find out what had happened to his men, he wasn't met by a helpless widow and a broken cowboy. He was met by the law. His reign of terror ended not with a dramatic shootout, but with the quiet, final click of handcuffs. As the first snowflakes of winter began to fall, dusting the land in a blanket of clean, quiet white, a profound peace settled over the small homestead. Jedediah looked at Sarah, holding their daughter, her face filled with a light he never thought he'd see. He looked at Cody, who was no longer silent, but laughing as he tried to catch a snowflake on his tongue. The boy reached out and took his hand. They weren't a collection of broken people anymore. They weren't a strange arrangement born of desperation. They were a family, forged in secrets and sacrifice, their future stretching out before them, as clean and promising as the fresh fallen snow. And so the story of the pregnant woman and the cowboy she bought came to a close, leaving the town of Redemption's Gulch to whisper a new legend, one not of despair and cruelty, but of incredible, unexpected resilience. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest acts of courage come from the most unlikely places, and that the strongest families are not born of blood, but are built from the ashes of shared hardship and an unwavering, defiant hope. This was a story that truly left the entire town in tears, not of sorrow, but of awe and inspiration. If this story of courage, sacrifice, and unexpected love moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share it with someone who appreciates a powerful tale of justice, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories from the heart of history. Your support allows us to keep digging, to keep finding and telling these amazing stories. Thank you for listening.